Good afternoon and welcome to the Wavy Digital Desk. I'm your host, Sarah Good. Today we're going to be speaking about the election. We're 2 months away. Today is September 5th and the general election is taking place on November 5th. We know early voting and more comes before that date, but we're going to get started in seeing what's to come in the rest of this build up to Election Day. We have, and you've heard him here before, we have Dr. Benjamin Milewski with us today from Old Dominion University Political Science Department. He is our political expert here, and he's going to be giving us some insight as what to expect, what races we're sort of looking at, what the main topics maybe voters are interested in, and a little bit more. So I'm going to bring him on now. Ben, thanks so much for joining us.
Good morning.
You know, we've had you on here before, and I'm just going to play some B-roll to your left there while we're getting started for people to take a look. Obviously, we know who the candidates are coming down, but I do want to get into a little bit of, what sort of those races are, both locally and nationally, that we're really looking at going into this 2-month lead up to the election. To start, obviously, with what's on screen, what's really to come in the next 2 months in terms of the presidential election? We obviously see campaign events picking up. We see the debates coming up just next week. But what are you seeing? What do you think is to come really in the lead up in the next, 60 or so days?
I mean, it's really coming down. We're into the final sprint here. If you look at the money that both candidates have on hand, there's a significant funding gap between Trump and Kamala. But they both still have a lot of money. So we're going to see a lot of burn down going on in their campaign funds over the next 2 months. So prepare yourself. The ads are coming. If you haven't already seen them, more are coming after that. We're also going to start seeing a lot more surrogates on the trail for both of the candidates, right? So they're going to be stumping throughout the country, everybody from the second gentleman already out there to VP candidates rolling around to party officials. So it's be prepared for seeing just in the news that candidates are going to be around and surrogates are going to be around for rallies and especially in the area.
Absolutely. And, we've talked a lot as this has sort of built up. Obviously, they're newer candidates against each other than would be in a traditional race. Just quickly for the debate Tuesday, I mean, what do you think those top issues are? Do you think they're all really going to be focused on the economy, world issues? I mean, what are some of the things that you really expect them to touch on?
So this is interesting, right? I mean, we had the first presidential debate back in June, and we're kind of getting a redo, right? So this is now a chance for Kamala to get out there and speak to a lot of issues. She's been criticized up to this point that she really hasn't been in front of the media a whole heck of a lot. She hasn't really spoke policy or, we don't want to, candidates don't want to get in the weeds, but really laying out a policy proposal. So I think we're really going to see across the board conversations about the main issues, right? It's going to be the economy. It's going to be focused on foreign affairs. It's going to be focused on domestic protection. It's going to be focused on social issues like gun control and abortion, right? So these are, top tier issues that are on the minds of the public. And it's giving a chance for now this new presidential candidate to lay out her vision. And at the same time, it allows Trump to, continue to lay out his vision, attack Kamala on basically being part of the current administration and trying to hold her to that.
And, you brought up some issues that just this week, yesterday, tragic high school shooting in Georgia where 2 students and 2 teachers died and more are injured. So now you're going into a debate where something is very much the forefront, if it wasn't already, and especially in terms of gun control, which you just mentioned. Do you think that resonates with voters in terms of what they want to hear, especially just being a few days past the event?
I think it's one of these where it's on the mind of the public, right? If you look at kind of the most important issues that, Gallup and Pew do all the time, gun violence is continuously up there, right? I mean, obviously it fluctuates over time with things like the economy and immigration, right? But this will shoot it right back to the top of the list, or at least, near the top of the list. If we look at the impact of it, right, outside of just, conversations during the debate, right, this took place in Georgia, which both candidates and both parties are looking as kind of a must-win state, right? So this is a state where Kamala's, her approval has been shooting up. She's doing very well there. And this could drive a lot of voters to the polls.
I want to talk to, going a little bit more local. There are a couple elections, let's start in Virginia, that people are looking at, from, senator races to races for, U.S. congressmen. Do you want to start with Kagan's race? That's one that we're seeing a lot of commercials of right now, and that one seems to be one in the forefront.
Yeah, this is a race that, for the last several election cycles, it's been a district, and, obviously there's been some redistricting changes to it, but it's been a district that's been going back and forth in terms of partisan control. And this is a district which the Democrats are targeting as one of their kind of 34 congressional districts, with either a Republican incumbent or an open seat where they're throwing a lot of money and attention at. This is a district that basically Biden, had won, but if you kind of match it up to the new redistricting cycle, he would have won by two. It's a district that Republicans won by three in 2022. So it's a race where we're really starting to see issues that have played out since 2022, 2023, and again in 2024. They're coming to the loggerhead. They're the same things. Missy has very much made reproductive rights a centerpiece of her campaign. We've seen this kind of moving up the ladder in terms of congressional campaigns. Kamala Harris has been talking about reproductive rights. Candidates have been talking about the recodifying of Roe after the fact. So abortion is going to be effectively on the ballot in the second. And if you look at the candidates themselves, they're very similar in terms of backgrounds, right? They're kind of very moderate candidates, which the district would demand. They both are career naval. So they've spoken a lot to veterans issues and veterans rights. So this is a district where I think a lot of on election night we are going to be looking at to help us understand kind of where the country's going and where control of Congress will be after election night.
And I know that that's a big piece of this too. I think people have a lot of eyes and conversation about the presidential election, but how the makeup of Congress is going to be, I think, is just as important in some of what they're saying, talking about, what could be done, in the new Congress that we'll see, come January. North Carolina, also very important state this election cycle of what's to come. Can you go through some of those big roles that we're really trying to fill, come November?
Yeah, I mean, so before we even get to the federal level, there are state elections taking place in North Carolina, right? So North Carolina's House of Representatives is one of 85 state legislative chambers that are holding elections in 2024, right? So we think about state legislative elections chambers, there's 99 of them because Nebraska only has one chamber, right? But 85 state chambers are holding elections this cycle. So if you look at the House, right, this is one where Republicans have control. And they also have control over the Senate. But the governorship, right? We have Roy Cooper, who is term limited out. So we have the governor on the ballot as well this election cycle. So North Carolina is a very interesting state to watch in this election cycle because it's a state where Trump only won by about 50, I think it's 58,000 votes. So very small margin there. It's a state which the Democrats have been throwing a lot of money into over the last 2 years, and especially this election cycle. And so if we think about it from what's going to happen at the federal level, if for whatever reason this is a state that the Democrats are able to push into, they flip, that could also have down ballot implications. So right now, the Republicans have 71 seats in the 120 seat state house, right? Is there potential that the Democrats can start to make inroads in there? And a lot of political scientists look at this as, all right, as the state's changing, could North Carolina eventually go the way several election cycles down the road that Virginia has, right? So we're starting to see kind of changes to these southern states.
And for North Carolina, that is a state where, we've seen it go both ways. We've seen a lot of action happening, especially in the last few elections. Is that a critical state to win? I want to say, just going back to the presidential election for a second, is that going to be a hard fight either way?
I think it's going to be a hard fight either way. If we go back to while Biden was in the race, right? And this is what, the Biden stepping out and Kamala stepping back in has fundamentally altered the electoral college map heading into election night, right? There was many paths for Trump to win the White House, much more over Joe Biden. But however, since Kamala stepping in, there's been a reinvigoration of the Democratic Party. Various constituency groups, like young individuals, have been kind of tapped and excited. The enthusiasm gap has radically changed. You look at Joe Biden's approval rating; it has radically changed in the weeks since, right? So those are all things that put a lot of states like North Carolina in play for the Democrats. Virginia was in play for the Republicans. But now, with kind of this fundamental change in the polling and in the candidates that are at play there, maybe Virginia is really not as much of a state in play as it was just what 7, 8 weeks ago at this point, not even, right? So you look at a state like North Carolina, you look at a state like Pennsylvania, you look at a state like Georgia. These are all states that, when you start counting up to that magic number of 270, candidates like Donald Trump, you have to win a state like North Carolina if you want to continue to keep open roads to the White House.
And it's interesting, you bring it up, I know we talk about polling data and we talk about them being ever changing. They're really just taken in the moment. But, looking at Virginia, it really was looking like a close state when it was Biden Trump. What do you think that shift is now? Is it that younger base? Is it just, a resurgence of energy? I mean, what do you think it is in Virginia that's, maybe tipped it so it's not as close of a state anymore?
I think it really was that enthusiasm gap, right? There was a lot of Democrats who were looking and hearing, the larger narrative that the road to the White House was just very slim. Trump was going to win it and run away with it. It was going to be a massive red wave. The insertion of Kamala into the election cycle has, like I said, fundamentally changed that. So what you're seeing is a lot of Democrats who either were kind of undecided on Biden, or they were thinking about kind of just staying home and, waving the white flag. A lot of them are returning back to the base, right? So it's getting them enthused, excited. But at the same time, we're also seeing other demographics like Black Americans, young Americans, starting to be activated, right? You're seeing those gains that Donald Trump had made, in particular amongst, say, Black Americans in Virginia. That those gains that he made are starting to wither away as enthusiasm for Kamala Harris is growing and has been growing since her announcement as the candidate. So what was the state of the race back in June is just gone, right? I mean, it's a fundamentally different and new race at this point. And it's very much put the Trump campaign on its heels, such that we look ahead to the debate on Tuesday night. And if anything, this is a bigger night for Donald Trump than it is for Kamala Harris in terms of trying to get that spark back into his campaigning and get off the back foot and get back onto the attack, and attacks that are actually effective.
And it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. They did say there was going to be a silence button basically for the other candidates. So both are going to have ample opportunity to speak. But we will see what is brought up in that debate next week. The other piece of national news that I think, or I should say international news, that's really played a part in the last couple years in politics now. I mean, almost 1 year since October 7th is, what we're seeing in, with Israel and Hamas. And we just saw, the hostage situation, take, a tragic turn just a few days ago. And so how are you seeing that national, international politics playing into this? Do you think that's going to be a big question on Tuesday for people to look at what's to come? Do you think people are associating Kamala, with the administration and maybe efforts there? I mean, what are you seeing in terms of maybe bringing international news, into this election cycle?
Yeah, international affairs are always tricky in terms of how impactful they'll be on an election cycle, right? We always think about things like the economy, right? It's the old saying, it's the economy stupid. It's pocketbook voting, right? That stuff tends to resonate with voters more. But in this election cycle, we've seen amongst young individuals, amongst those with Arab or Palestinian background, right, that that foreign affairs issue is important and is galvanizing. As we talked about before, leading into the DNC, there was a Palestinians for Harris PAC group that disbanded because they didn't get speaking time at the convention. So we look ahead to, what recently happened, and it's really fascinating, right? You look at the administration in Israel's response from Netanyahu, basically saying, "Look, we are still going to be hard line about this. We are going to wipe Hamas out." But then you saw public protests in the wake of it, and public support in Israel saying they want ceasefire. We don't want any more of these operations. Just get it to a ceasefire. And that in itself matches what the US administration has been pushing for, at least in kind of the recent months, in terms of the tagline. And so I think we will hear Kamala say, "Look, we are trying to mediate, we are trying to push for a ceasefire in Israel." She may even very well say, "The people themselves are demanding it." And as we've seen over the last several weeks, that tagline really plays well in the American public as well, too. However, this is going to be the chance for Donald Trump to step in and say, "Look, you know, there's been talk that he needs to move away from the saying, well, this would have never happened if I was in charge," as that line doesn't really work very much in the American public, but more so speaking to the ineffectiveness of the current administration to deal with the aftermath of this. So I think we're going to look forward to election night and really see, both candidates can kind of stay on script and stay on message, those very strong themes.
And, we're in the second week of class here at ODU, and I was curious, are you noticing yet, and I know it's a little early in the year, but how excited or maybe passionate maybe some of your students are, or maybe some people on campus, speaking politically, maybe getting involved, or what are you seeing, with that group that I feel like so many people have their eyes on right now?
Yeah, I can tell you we are in the middle of week 2 right now, and students are already charged up about the election cycle. They're interested in policy, right? They're talking about things like foreign affairs. They're talking about things like the economy. They themselves have been dealing with the brunt of things like inflation and rent increases. So they are enthused. They are excited. Many of the students I've talked to, they are actively involved with getting students registered to vote and figuring out where their polling places are. I think this election cycle, you are going to see, especially again, like I said, with the change in the candidates, we are seeing an enthused youth demographic. And that's something that at least the Democratic campaign is really trying to tap into, and something the Republicans have been trying to tap into the last several election cycles. Because if you go back, really the last 4 or 5 election cycles in Virginia, the youth vote has been drastically larger, with maybe the last election cycle being a little bit more tepid. But on the whole, much larger in this decade than the prior decades.
How do you feel about that in terms of, the last election? I think that, maybe it didn't seem like the youth or like the younger base was as motivated yet. I mean, I don't want to speak for your group. I think that they're probably very passionate students, but it seems that right now, the way things are trending, and you have Brad and you have colors and all these things. Do you think that's making an impact, and the change of candidates making an impact enough where we haven't really seen this group come out to the polls in the last, 2 to 4 years?
I think some of it's issue based, right? Abortion, again, post Roe, kind of was really active in the wake of Roe, the fall of Roe, and then kind of fell off, right, as kind of individual states were doing their things. But you get major election cycles like this that really attract attention back to it, right? You get Supreme Court decisions, like allowing Oklahoma or allowing the administration to strip healthcare funds from Oklahoma over abortion access. You deal with mass shootings like this, right? So a lot of it's issue based, right? It brings voters, especially young voters, to the polls. They're single issue voters. And then I think also they are actually really being targeted, right? For the longest time, we always talk about the get out the vote campaigns and we want to get youth vote out there. But you look at places like Arizona, there is a lot of money going from the DNC right there um, to, in particular, get young voters to the polls. And in an election where we're looking at a handful of swing states that are going to determine the election, some of these swing states were only won by, tens of thousands of votes. So we're talking a percentage or less of the vote. If you can get some of that youth demographic out there for your candidate, that's a win. I mean, you win the election for either a congressional candidate or you win the White House because of it.
And that issue of the economy, of inflation, that seems to be the main ticker right now in terms of what people are looking at and how potentially they're going to vote. What are you seeing in that way, with unemployment, inflation having that impact in the next 60 days?
Yeah, I mean, if we kind of just look at the economy itself, right? We go back to July, and we had the jobless rate rose. Employers only added about 114,000 new jobs in July, and that was well short of the forecasts. Employment ticked up to 4.3%. That was the highest level since 2021. So economists had a little bit of fear, right? So that are we, nearing or in the early stages of a recession, especially if those numbers continue into August. Um, so we're looking actually as tomorrow, we will get the jobs report for August. So if those numbers have gotten worse, right, that kind of scares economists a little bit that we're perhaps, really heading towards that recession. If the rate stabilizes or ticks down, the weak numbers may just be viewed as kind of a false alarm, right? The impact of that also is going to lead into what we're going to see this month, where the Federal Reserve is expected to kind of shift gears on its monetary policy and enact the first rate cut since the Fed started fighting inflation and tightening measures about 30 months ago. So all of that's going to come together in really the next month to let us see kind of what's going on with the economy. Is it softening or, softening and not collapsing? Or is it getting worse?
There's a lot to see and there's a lot to come, in terms of what we're going to see in the next 60 days. I did want to go back to briefly, the race for governor in North Carolina. Is
Mhm.
that in any way a mirror of what you're going to see? Is that we've talked about leans more Republican, but that's not our situation right now. So, I mean, what are you looking at really with that race?
Yeah, I mean, so it's one of 11 gubernatorial elections taking place this election cycle. And it's going to be interesting because there's four candidates on the ballot. I mean, we have Josh Stein, who's the incumbent AG for the state. You have Mark Robinson, the Republican candidate. You have Wayne Turner, a Green candidate, and you have Mike Ross, a Libertarian candidate. So it's as we look at North Carolina, it's going to be a close race. And it's frankly shaping up to be one of the most expensive races as well in the country right now. But it's fascinating because this is a state where it's been so close. You have a incumbent Democratic governor, Roy Cooper, very popular, was potentially being tapped for the VP slot. You have Democratic-controlled state legislature with large majorities in both chambers. So this could mirror, what we see in the country, right? So if for whatever reason the Democrats are having a really good night, we could see Josh Stein, who's an incumbent with that name recognition, have a good night there, beat Mark Robinson. Wayne Turner maybe doesn't take too many votes away as the Green Party candidate. Mike Ross perhaps will take some percentage of the vote away from Mark Robinson. But then we look down ballot and we see what happens in the state legislature. Do the Democrats make inroads in a lot of these districts, which are much more Republican friendly? And I don't expect them to take control of the North Carolina legislature by any means. But do they start making inroads there that'll start shifting the state in the future? Do we see what happens in North Carolina's first district with Don Davis, right? This was originally a district that Republicans were targeting as maybe a flip. But now is this something that Don Davis will, solidly hold against Lori Buckout? And then further, we have the Attorney General election taking place there. And this one is fascinating. It's going to help us really understand a lot of what's going on in Congress. You have effectively two candidates that are running for the Attorney General's race that are both incumbent U.S. congresspersons. So you have Jackson from North Carolina's 14th and Bishop from North Carolina's 8th. So you have both candidates that they themselves have elevated the race because they're U.S. Congress candidates. So long story short, there are so many things to be paying attention to in North Carolina that can really give us some insight to how the rest of the country is going to be going.
There's a lot to look at, and I know that, again, as we mentioned at the beginning, eyes are talking about the presidential election, but here, especially in Hampton Roads, as we're in North Carolina and in Southeast Virginia, there are so many races to look at. So I know it's going to be a very dynamic next 60 days is probably one of the bottom lines.
Yeah, I mean, as I said to start, and I've used this term before, buckle up. I mean, even though, I would say Virginia is not that like Republicans going to flip it risk anymore that we were talking about back in June, there still are some really interesting races taking place here in the Hampton Roads area as well as North Carolina. So be prepared. Both candidates, and at the top of the ticket, as well as all the candidates down the ballot, there's a lot of money in this election cycle. And we're going to go into a burn down phase where airwaves are going to be just saturated with campaign ads, radio waves saturated, and rightly so. We want voters to know that an election's taking place and to get out and vote.
And just today, even, heading into next year, there's more news about the Virginia gubernatorial race. So, it's never going to stop here, with the off year, in Virginia. So it will be interesting as we keep seeing that, especially as the presidential election slows down. That is going to be the next thing that's coming up, especially here in the state. But Ben, thank you so much again for joining us. It's, always nice to hear your analysis of what's happening and keep people informed. If anyone has further questions, head over to wavy.com. There's more information from your local election headquarters, and there will be, heading into the election season, information about voting, how to register, how to early vote, as well as the candidates that are going to be both in Virginia and North Carolina. But Ben, thanks so much again for joining us this afternoon.
My pleasure as always.